This week we're going to cover chapter 3, which is about internal alignment or internal equity. We'll talk about external equity in later chapters. So internal alignment or internal equity are the pay relationships within an organization among the different jobs, skills, and competencies that people bring to those jobs. So the way that you get internal equity, or the way that you should plan this out, is you should have a strategic approach to your compensation. That's often what determining what the jobs are that you're going to have, and the skills and competencies that you need for those jobs is really important in terms of how are we going to implement our organizational strategy. Then what you're going to do is you're going to figure out the pay relationships within your organization based on those jobs, the skills, and the competencies that you are needing within your organization to implement your strategic or your strategy for your organization. And then you're going to create your pay structure based on that. Your pay structure is the array or the combination of pay rates that you have for different work or different skills and competencies within your organization. And we can look at pay structures and contrast and compare them based on the number of levels they have, the differentials in pay between the levels. So the differences from, say, level 1 to level 2, for example, within a pay structure. And then the criteria that you're using to determine differences described in the structure. And the criteria could be, for example, skills or competencies. It could also be job titles, something like that. Pay structures support your organizational strategy because they help you determine what jobs, skills, and competencies you actually need to implement your pay strategy. They can support the workflow, so how people get their work done within the organization, and they can motivate behavior toward the organizational objectives. So we'll talk about that a little bit more in the next few slides. Organizational strategy, as we talked about last week, supports your competitive advantage. And you can have a strategy, an organizational strategy that leads to a compensation strategy that is quite different from your competitors. But you could also be in an industry where everyone has very similar compensation strategies because the organizational strategy is fairly similar as well. I'm imagining something like auditing firms that within their industry, there could be some differences in compensation strategy, but the main work is the same. So there may be some similarities in the way that organizational strategies and compensation strategies are created within organizations in that same industry. Your pay structure supports your workflow as well. So the workflow is the process by which goods and services are delivered to a customer. So this could be something like having specific relationships with people within your company for each of the customers that you handle. It could be something like making sure that all of your employees provide good customer service, even if they're not given to a dedicated customer or client. The workflow is also how those things get made and how they get created within the organization. So are you working in teams, for example, to work with clients? Do you have a factory where you're producing goods? Or are you an artist where you're the only person who creates the good that you sell, and that is your workflow? Like, how do you get something done, like sculpting a piece of art or creating a piece of pottery? Your internal pay structures are part of that network of returns we talked about last week that employees expect from the organization, which does mean that your employees at some level need to understand your pay structure, even if they don't need to know all of the details or all of the nuances of that pay structure. For many organizations, it's a challenge to design structures that engage employees and help achieve their organizational objectives. You could create a pay structure that you think as a manager makes complete sense in terms of the jobs you need and the skills and competencies that employees need to do those jobs. But if you're not paying enough versus what employees are expecting to be paid for those skills and competencies or the jobs that they're doing, then it doesn't matter how you've designed your pay structure. It's not going to work for motivating your employees. A really good example is in the last few years, coming out of the pandemic, a lot of entry-level jobs, the pay was going up. And part of the reason pay was going up was because of inflation, but part of it was that there were very few employees, but many jobs available. And so a lot of organizations were just having a hard time at attracting and retaining employees for entry-level jobs. So a lot of organizations had to redo their pay structures, at least for those entry-level jobs, because the way they were paying before wasn't going to motivate employees anymore to either get a job or to keep that job within that organization. So by redesigning your pay structure, you've increased the pay for entry-level jobs, which often means that you have to consider all the jobs in your pay structure and how much you need to increase the pay for everyone, so that you don't have things like entry-level workers coming in and being paid more than the managers that supervise them. And so that was a huge challenge for a lot of organizations, and something that many of them are still working through. Your structure has to have a clear relationship as well between each job and the organization's objectives. That's what we call the line of sight. If you have jobs in your pay structure that there's not a clear line of sight to the strategy for the organization or the objectives that will help to actually implement that strategy, then it's not clear why you have that job and where it should fit in the pay structure. So you have to make that determination for every single job. And hopefully, as you're making the pay structure, that becomes very clear how every job is contributing to the organizational strategy. Structures can vary among different organizations. And part of that variance, as I said, is the way that we define pay structures, because you can compare and contrast them through their number of levels, their pay differentials between levels, and the criteria that you use to determine those levels and differentials, whether that criteria is the job and the job title or the skills and competencies that people need to do those jobs. One feature of pay structures in all organizations is their hierarchical nature, and hierarchical nature includes that number of levels that we've discussed are different across pay structures, but also reporting relationships, which means who is supervising whom, and of your employees, who has to go to whom in terms of management. You can have more hierarchical organizations. This is very common in something like a bureaucracy, like education, where we just have these very big institutions and you have a lot of different people doing different jobs. There's just a lot of hierarchy then, because there's a lot of people that you're trying to organize in your pay structure. You can also have a lot of hierarchy because that's the way that you want to motivate your employees. If you have a lot of different levels, it often means, if you look on this third point, that your pay differentials are going to be smaller between those different levels. And so the ability for an employee to move from one level to the next might be a little bit easier because they just need maybe a few years of experience. They need maybe a certificate or some kind of certification to move up levels, versus if you have very few, if you have a compressed structure where you have very few levels, the next level up might be quite a bit of work to get to, because it might be so far in terms of difference between the skills and competencies you need at one level to the next level up. It also means you probably have bigger pay differentials, which could be very motivating for employees. So a really good example is many of you have or will work in organizations where you have entry-level jobs, and after you have a few years of experience and perhaps go through some management training, you can move up to the next level, which is management or supervision. In some organizations, that move up won't be very much of an increase in pay, but you might have more responsibility. And in others, it might be a significant increase in pay, and actually your job, the content of your job has changed drastically. That's the difference between having more levels in your hierarchy versus compressed levels, but the levels are quite different from one to the other, much more so in terms of pay and maybe even the kinds of skills and competencies you need among those different levels. So we can look at criteria that is used to determine those different, the pay structure in terms of content and value. Content would be the work that's performed in a job and how it gets done. So I'm going to use teaching as an example because I know at least all of you have some experience with that job, even if you've never done it yourself. The content of a teacher, what you probably see is like me making this video right now. You might see some of the objects of our class, like assignments or discussion boards or a syllabus. But all of that is part of the work of an instructor. An instructor also has to have knowledge of the thing they're going to teach, which sometimes you may be an expert on, and sometimes you may just have knowledge of because of the educational background or the work experience that you have. You also have to design the whole class. You have to determine what topics will be taught. You need to pick a textbook if you want one, or design your own textbook and activities if you need them. You need to design all of your assignments. You have to figure out how you're going to grade. You're going to have to figure out a syllabus and what will be the schedule for that class. So there's a lot of work that goes into the content of teaching. The value or the worth of that work can be different. It can be different within an organization and outside of organizations and in different organizations. So teaching in terms of within an organization can be paid differently. For example, at the university, Someone who teaches like this class, compensation class, is likely being paid more than someone who teaches an English 101 class. And there are some big differences in the value of that work. This class, for example, is within a business school. So business schools tend to pay more because the competition for people within business schools is much more. And also where the money comes from can be quite different a little bit than for other schools because alumni give a lot of money. But it could also be that you all think that this class is pretty useful if you're going into HR because it directly impacts your major and what you might do with the rest of your life, or at least part of your career. English 101, although very valuable, I think, for writing skills and communication, can be taught by a graduate student. It can be taught by someone who doesn't even have a master's degree yet, let alone a PhD. My class right here, you have to have at least a master's degree to do. It also might have the same syllabus for all the classes. So even the content of the work could be quite different if everyone's using the same syllabus because a group of people designed that class then. And simply what you're doing is giving that information to students and then grading their work. But also, I would say a lot of universities, that English 101 is not considered as valuable because it's not really part of anyone's major. Lots of people have to take that class, but it's not specific to the kinds of jobs that students will have outside of their degree program, but could be valuable in developing the skills they might need for those jobs. So the value of the work can be quite different within an organization. And then outside of an organization, you can consider if someone's teaching like an introductory business class at Kansas State versus at a community college, the person at Kansas State is probably going to get paid more. And part of that is the way that the society values the work. A community college, the highest degree you can get is an associate's degree, which is a 2-year degree, very valuable. But a lot of the research shows us that people with 4-year degrees and graduate degrees often are paid more. And since the state really cares about the way that teaching can help the economic value of the state, they're going to see those 4-year degrees and those masters and PhDs as much more valuable than the associate's degree that a community college could provide. And so they're going to pay less to the community college instructor who's teaching exactly the same content and has to do exactly the same parts of their job as someone at Kansas State simply because of the organizations they're working in. You can have, and we'll talk about these in future chapters, job-based structures, which are really structured. The way that pay is structured and the way that the job is structured is based on the content of the work that you have to do. You can also have structures that are based on the person who's filling that job. So the skills and competencies that person's bringing to the job, whether they use those skills and competencies for the job at all or even very often. Most jobs are going to be both. So like my job, for example, there's a job-based structure in the sense that my work content is both teaching and research. That's the job I have. The title I have conveys that I do both of those things as part of my job. But there is a person-based structure into my job. They had someone, I have to have a PhD, but my PhD is specifically in the area that right now that I'm teaching. I have skills and competencies like an HR certification. I have a lot of background experience and research that's apart from my PhD program. Those are all things that, although I couldn't negotiate much on my pay because internal equity is very important in my department, it does help me when I come up for merit pay or for other promotions because those are skills and competencies I can bring to my job that I can use within the job structure that has been created for my position. We also have what we call use value and exchange value, and these are different things as well. So don't get them super confused with content and value generally because they're not exactly the same thing, but they are related. I mean, they have the word value in them. So use value is really about goods and services that an employee produces in a job, how those get done, how those get made. And how that job or what that employee produces contributes to the organizational strategy. So you can have similar job content in two different companies, like the example I just gave with a teaching instructor for a business class at K-State versus a community college. And they can be differently valued because of how they contribute to organizational objectives. And here I would say organizational strategy in terms of the community college and in terms of Kansas State. But also potentially through the state legislature that also gives us money for these. So, at Kansas State, that teaching is really important because it brings in students not only to fill in classes, but a lot of you are going to do things like work on campus. Some of you will do research. Many of you will be part of student organizations that have a face to the community and that sort of thing. Those are all things that you contribute to Kansas State that make my job very valuable because I'm keeping you here by teaching you the classes you need to get your degree. At a community college, you have a lot less of those things. No one's working on research. Your students Likely, a lot of them are going to be commuter students who aren't very involved on campus, and that sort of thing. So the value of the students and the teacher who's teaching the students might be less just because of what it brings into the strategy for that community college, which is simply to teach students to get an associate's degree or to move on to a different institution for a higher degree, like a bachelor's or a master's degree. The exchange value is different from your use value. The exchange value is whatever wage the employer and employee can agree on for a job. And I'm going to say right now that we're going to talk a little bit about exchange values that might be legitimate, like the example we have in the book. If you are doing a job in Kansas City and doing that same job in New York City, you're likely going to get paid quite differently, probably much more in New York City, not only because the cost of living in New York City is more, but also because depending on what your job is, the location might matter a lot. So if you're in finance, for example, maybe you're doing trades. You can work maybe in Kansas City. I don't know. I'm not in finance, but you're more likely to be in New York City because other people who do that same job are in New York City. So you're building a network. You're working with other people who do the same job. And because the computer systems and everything that do those trades are in New York City, you actually can be faster by working in New York City on a trade than you can be in Kansas City, where you have to send a signal on a computer a much longer distance. And so you could actually have different pay as well, not only for cost of living, but because the job is actually valued more when it's in New York City versus Kansas City. We can also have what I'm calling illegitimate or biased exchange values, and we'll talk more about this in later chapters, where people like women are paid often less than men for the same job, or people of color are paid less than white people are for the same job. And that is because there are biases in the negotiation process between the employer and employee that affect how much the employee can make, but has nothing to do with how well that employee can do that job or anything about how that job contributes to the organizational strategy. So I want to just keep that in mind when we're talking about exchange value.